Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's been generating a lot of buzz lately.
Yeah.
EMFs, electromagnetic fields.
Right.
They're everywhere, right? Our
Yeah.
phones, our Wi-Fi,
Family lines.
power lines, even there's natural magnetic field. But the question
Mhm.
is, are they really something to worry about? And
That's the million-dollar question, not a simple one to answer.
yeah, that's why we brought in an expert to help us unpack it all.
Absolutely.
So to navigate this landscape, we've got two really interesting sources we're going to be looking at.
Okay.
One is a 2018 paper by Professor Martin Pall,
Yeah.
who really digs deep into the nitty-gritty of how EMFs might be impacting our bodies at a cellular level.
He gets down to the mechanisms, really fascinating stuff.
And the other source is a 2022 paper from the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields.
Oh, the ICBE-EMF.
Yeah, mouthful.
Yeah.
So we've got a deep dive into the mechanisms and a broader look at the potential health implications.
Exactly. And one thing that both sources emphasize is this idea of non-thermal effects.
Non-thermal effects.
So, we all know that EMFs can generate heat,
Sure, like a microwave.
like a microwave oven, but what these papers highlight is that there might be other biological effects happening at levels that don't cause significant heating.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit.
Okay.
Why is this distinction between thermal and non-thermal effects so important?
It's crucial because it challenges the way we set safety limits for EMF exposure.
Okay.
So those limits are largely based on preventing tissue heating.
Right.
But if there are other harmful effects happening at lower levels, we might not be as protected as we think.
That's a little unsettling.
Yeah.
If these non-thermal effects are a real concern, what kind of harm are we talking about?
Well, Professor Pall, in his paper, lays out 8 key categories of potential harm.
8.
8, and he cites a ton of research to back them up. Some of the most concerning ones involve impacts to our nervous systems, our endocrine systems, and even our DNA.
Okay, those are some biggies.
Yeah.
So nervous system issues, what kind of things are we talking about there?
So he points to things like sleep disruption, fatigue,
Oh, interesting.
even anxiety and depression. And there's evidence suggesting that EMFs might be interfering with our brainwave patterns and neurotransmitter function.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot to process.
It is.
And what about endocrine disruption? That's our hormonal system, right?
Right. And hormones are incredibly powerful messengers. They control so many vital functions in our bodies.
Yeah.
What these sources suggest is that EMFs might be messing with our hormone production and sensitivity.
And this is where things like fertility come into play.
Yeah.
Because both sources specifically mention reproductive harm,
Yes.
especially in men.
Especially in men.
Yeah.
And the 2022 source, the ICBE-EMF paper, goes into some detail about this. They cite studies where men who use cell phones for extended periods had significantly more DNA damage in their sperm.
Oh, wow.
And the kicker is this damage seemed to worsen the longer they use their phones each day.
That's definitely alarming.
Yeah.
And I remember reading about a study where mouse sperm cells exposed to cell phone radiation actually showed higher levels of DNA damage when the phone was in dialing mode compared to listening mode.
Oh, wow.
So even the specific activity of the phone seemed to matter.
That's interesting.
It is fascinating, and it underscores the point that we might be underestimating the impact of these seemingly small everyday exposures.
Yeah.
It's not just about holding a phone to your ear for hours on end.
No, it's not.
So we've got potential nervous system effects, hormonal disruption, sperm damage, and then there's the DNA damage itself. That one always feels particularly scary because it's linked to cancer and other serious health problems.
Definitely a major concern.
Yeah.
And Professor Powell actually breaks down 3 main ways that EMFs might be attacking our DNA. First, there are single-strand breaks, which can lead to errors when our cells try to copy their DNA. Then there are double-strand breaks, which are even more serious because they can cause major chromosomal chaos.
So it's like ripping a page out of a book versus just smudging a word or two.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And then there's the issue of oxidized bases, which are like typos in the DNA code.
Okay.
These typos can accumulate over time and lead to mutations that can potentially trigger cancer or other diseases.
So we're talking about damage at the very core of our biological blueprint.
Yes, we are.
And what's even more concerning is that the 2022 source highlights a specific marker called 8OHDG, which is a clear sign of oxidative DNA damage.
Right.
and studies show that it increases with exposure to EMFs.
So there's a measurable biological indicator that this damage is actually happening.
Right.
And it's not just theoretical.
Yeah.
They cite real-world studies showing a link between EMF exposure and an increased risk of certain cancers.
Okay, this is getting pretty heavy, but it's important to understand the science.
Absolutely.
Before we move on, I want to circle back to the hormonal piece for a moment.
Okay.
We all know that hormones are powerful, and even slight imbalances can have a huge impact on our health and well-being.
Huge impact.
Can you break down a bit more about how EMFs might be messing with our hormonal systems?
Sure. One important distinction they make in the 2022 source is between steroid hormones,
Okay.
like testosterone and estrogen,
Uh-huh.
and non-steroid hormones.
Okay.
When it comes to steroid hormones, EMFs seem to lower their production.
And that's a problem because,
Well, think about the roles that testosterone and estrogen play in our bodies.
yeah,
They're involved in everything from muscle growth and bone density to mood, energy levels, and reproductive function.
right. So messing with those hormones could have cascading effects throughout the body.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's the impact on non-steroid hormones,
Bye.
which are involved in things like stress response, sleep regulation, and metabolism. With non-steroid hormones, EMFs can initially increase their release.
Okay.
But long-term exposure might lead to what they call exhaustion of these systems.
So it's like our bodies are constantly being bombarded and eventually they just can't keep up.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And it can manifest in a variety of ways: fatigue, insomnia, anxiety, even weight gain, or difficulty losing weight.
So what we might perceive as just everyday stresses or lifestyle issues
Right.
could actually be rooted in a deeper underlying disruption of our hormonal balance caused by EMF exposure.
Exactly.
That's a pretty profound insight.
It is.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to take a little break, folks.
Okay.
And when we come back, we'll dive even deeper into the specifics of how these EMFs might be doing their damage and what we can do about it.
That's good.
All right, we're back. And I'm still kind of reeling from some of the stuff we covered in part one. DNA damage, hormonal chaos,
It's a lot.
It is a lot to take in. But knowledge is power.
Right.
And to really understand how to protect ourselves, we need to get into the nitty-gritty of how these EMFs are actually messing with our bodies.
Exactly. And you know what? Professor Paul's paper doesn't just lay out the problems. He actually dives deep into the mechanisms.
Oh, good.
And he keeps mentioning these VGCCs, voltage-gated calcium channels.
Yeah.
Which, to be honest, sounded like a foreign language to me at first.
Yeah, you and me both.
Yeah.
So break it down for us. What are these VGCCs and why are they so important in this whole EMF story?
Okay, so imagine, like, our cells have these tiny little doorways,
Okay.
like security checkpoints
Uh-huh.
that control what goes in and out. These doorways are the VGCCs,
Got it.
and their job is to let calcium ions into the cell when needed.
Calcium, like what's in milk? What does that have to do with EMFs?
Yeah, it's the same calcium,
Yeah.
but inside our cells, it plays a totally different role.
Okay.
It's like a signaling molecule, a messenger. It tells the cell what to do. Everything, like from muscle contractions to nerve impulses, hormone release, calcium is involved.
Oh, wow. Okay, so calcium's important. These VGCCs are the gatekeepers.
Right.
I'm starting to see the connection here.
Exactly. And what Paul argues, with a ton of research to back him up, is that EMS essentially jam these doorways open, disrupting that delicate balance.
Ooh.
It's like if someone tampered with the lock on a security gate, things can get in that aren't supposed to be there.
So we're talking about a calcium overload inside the cell. What happens then?
Chaos,
Okay.
basically.
Oh,
This excess calcium, it triggers a cascade of reactions that can lead to all sorts of problems, including those 8 harms we talked about earlier: oxidative stress, DNA damage, hormonal disruption, you name it.
wow.
It's like throwing a wrench into the delicate machinery of the cell.
That's a pretty scary thought.
It is.
But if this VGCC mechanism is so central to EMF effects, why isn't everyone talking about it? I mean, why isn't this bigger news?
That's a great question, and I think it gets at the heart of some of the challenges around EMF research.
Yeah.
It's a complex field with a lot of conflicting information out there, and it can be hard to separate the science from the hype.
But these two sources we're looking at, they're both pretty reputable, right?
Oh, absolutely. Professor Pall is a well-respected researcher. He's been studying the biological effects of EMFs for decades.
Mhm.
And the ICBE-EMF is an international commission made up of leading scientists in the field.
Yeah.
They're not just some fringe group pushing a conspiracy theory.
Right, so their concerns should be taken seriously. And one thing that really struck me is that they both emphasize that this isn't just happening in a petri dish or in lab rats.
Right.
They cite a lot of human studies that suggest these non-thermal effects are happening in the real world.
That's a crucial point. We can't just dismiss this as some abstract, scientific theory.
Yeah.
There's growing evidence that these EMFs are impacting our health in very real ways.
So can you give us some examples? What kind of human studies are we talking about?
Well, the 2022 paper, for example, reviews a whole body of research on neurological effects
Okay.
in animals exposed to levels of EMFs considered safe by current standards. And they found consistent, reproducible deficits in spatial learning and memory.
What does that mean?
That means our brains might be taking a hit without us even realizing it.
That's definitely not something I want to hear.
And that's just one example.
Oh, gosh.
They also highlight studies that show EMFs might have co-carcinogenic effects,
Co-carcinogenic.
meaning they could make other carcinogens, like certain chemicals, even more potent.
Oh, wow.
So it's not just about EMFs causing cancer directly, it's about them potentially amplifying the risk from other environmental factors.
Wow, that's scary.
It is concerning. And speaking of concerning, remember that Yale study we talked about in part 1?
You mean the one where pregnant mice exposed to cell phone radiation had offspring with ADHD-like symptoms?
Exactly. They found those mice. They had hyperactivity, memory problems. Those are serious developmental issues.
Yeah.
And what's really striking is that the 2022 paper connects this animal study to human epidemiological studies that have found a link between prenatal cell phone exposure and ADHD in children.
So we're potentially talking about impacts that could span generations.
It's a sobering thought. And they also highlight research on how EMFs might be messing with the magnetic sense that some animals use for navigation. Think about birds, turtles, even fish.
Yeah.
If their internal compass gets thrown off, that could have huge implications for their survival.
It's like a domino effect, right?
Yeah.
Disrupting one thing can ripple out and affect entire ecosystems.
Exactly. And all of this raises a big looming question on everyone's mind. 5G.
Everyone's talking about 5G, faster speeds, more connectivity. But what about safety? Is this just a faster version of what we're already dealing with? Or is it a whole new ball game in terms of potential risks?
Well, the 2022 source is pretty critical of the assumption that 5G is safe just because it uses higher frequencies that mostly penetrate the skin. They point out that the skin itself is incredibly important for our health. We shouldn't just dismiss the potential impacts on this vital organ.
So what are their specific concerns about 5G?
They talk about the risk of skin cancer, especially when combined with sun exposure. They're also concerned about weakening of the skin's barrier function,
Right?
which is our first line of defense against infections and environmental toxins.
So it's not just about what's happening inside our bodies,
Right.
but also about how our outermost layer, our skin, is affected.
Right. They also raise the issue of potential damage to the eyes. And of course, there's the fact that 5G uses higher frequencies and wider bandwidths than previous generations of wireless technology. We're essentially venturing into uncharted territory in terms of potential biological effects.
Meaning we simply don't have enough data yet to say with certainty what the long-term consequences of widespread 5G exposure might be.
Exactly. And both of these sources advocate for applying the precautionary principle when it comes to EMFs, especially with the rollout of 5G.
The precautionary principle, remind me what that is again.
It's the idea that when there's a potential for harm, even if we don't have definitive proof yet, we should take steps to mitigate the risk.
Yeah.
It's better to be safe than sorry, especially when we're talking about something as pervasive as EMFs.
I like that philosophy. But with EMFs being everywhere, our phones, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth devices, smart meters, even power lines, it can feel pretty overwhelming. What can we do to protect ourselves in a world that's so saturated with these invisible forces?
It's definitely a lot to take in, but awareness is the first step. Knowing the potential risks, it empowers you to make choices about how you manage your exposure.
So it's not about living in a Faraday cage and cutting ourselves off from all technology.
Not at all. It's about being mindful and making small changes that can add up to a big difference.
Like what? Give us some practical tips.
Well, for starters, think about how you use your cell phone. Using speakerphone or wired headphones instead of holding it to your ear can dramatically reduce the amount of radiation going straight to your head.
Simple but effective. What else?
Keeping your phone out of your pocket, especially if you're a guy, is another easy one.
Oh, yeah.
Think about it. Do you really want a device emitting EMFs right next to your reproductive organs all day long?
Good point. I'm definitely guilty of that one.
Hmm.
Anything else?
The 2022 paper has a whole table with recommendations.
Oh.
And one I found particularly interesting was the need to educate medical professionals about electromagnetic hypersensitivity,
EHS.
or EHS.
Okay.
People are experiencing these symptoms, but doctors often don't know how to diagnose or treat them.
It's like we need a whole new paradigm of healthcare to address this emerging issue.
And of course, there's the need for more independent research.
Right.
We need more science that's not funded by the industries that profit from these technologies.
Right, because if the fox is guarding the hen house, we're not going to get a very accurate assessment of the risks.
Exactly. And for those who want to take, like, extra precautions, there are EMF shielding products available.
Sure.
Things like phone cases, laptop pads, even bed canopies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So there are options out there for people who want to minimize their exposure. This is all fantastic information, but I know we're running out of time for this segment.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts before we wrap up part 2?
Just this. The science around EMFs is evolving rapidly. It's important to stay informed, keep asking questions, and be your own advocate when it comes to your health.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And listener, we know this is heavy stuff. Don't panic, but do take it seriously. Join us for the final part of this deep dive, where we'll explore some of the bigger questions raised by these sources, the social, political, and economic forces at play. Because this goes way beyond individual health choices. We're talking about the very fabric of our technological society. Welcome back to the final part of our EMF deep dive.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. We've gone from the basics of what EMFs are to exploring some pretty unsettling potential health effects, diving deep into the cellular mechanisms,
Yeah.
even getting practical with tips for reducing exposure.
Right.
But as promised, in this last part, I want to step back and look at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Because honestly, this whole EMF issue raises some really profound questions about our relationship with technology, our health, and the future of our planet.
You're absolutely right.
It's not just about individual choices anymore. We're talking about a global phenomenon that's impacting every aspect of our lives.
Absolutely.
And one thing that really struck me reading both of these sources was this sense of urgency,
Yeah.
almost a plea from the scientific community to take this issue more seriously.
Yeah. I think there's definitely a feeling that we're at a crossroads. Technology is advancing at an incredible pace, but our understanding of its potential impact is lagging behind.
It's like we're building the plane while we're flying it, and we're not even sure if we've got all the parts.
That's a great analogy.
And the stakes are incredibly high.
They are?
We're talking about potentially widespread health problems,
Yeah.
ecosystem disruption, even impacts on future generations.
Absolutely.
So if the research is growing and the concerns are so serious, why aren't we hearing more about this? Why isn't this front page news? Why aren't there more widespread warnings?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's a complicated one.
Yeah.
Professor Pall actually addresses this in his 2018 paper.
Okay.
He argues that there's a systemic bias, both within the scientific community and among regulatory agencies, to downplay or dismiss the non-thermal effects of EMFs.
Why would that be?
Well,
It seems counterintuitive to ignore potential health risks.
it does. He points to the influence of the telecommunications industry,
Okay.
which obviously has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo.
Sure.
They've invested billions of dollars in building this wireless infrastructure, and any suggestion that their products might be harmful is a major threat to their bottom line.
Yeah, it's the classic follow the money scenario, right?
It often comes down to that.
Yeah.
And when you have powerful industries with deep pockets, lobbying policymakers, and influencing research agendas, it can be very difficult for dissenting voices to be heard.
It's like David versus Goliath, but with a whole lot more at stake than just a slingshot and a few stones.
Exactly. And unfortunately, in this case, Goliath has a massive PR machine, a global reach, and a product that's become almost indispensable to modern life.
So what can we do? I mean, it can feel pretty helpless going up against these giant corporations and the forces that be.
You're right, it can feel overwhelming,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean we're powerless.
Okay.
Remember that 2022 paper from the ICBE-EMF?
Yeah.
They offer some concrete recommendations for moving forward.
Refresh my memory. What are some of those recommendations?
Well, they talk about the need for more transparency in research funding.
Okay.
Right now, it can be really difficult to know who's paying for a study.
Yeah.
And that can obviously influence the results.
So we need to demand independent science. Science that's not beholden to corporate interests.
Exactly. And we need to support organizations that are advocating for stricter safety standards. And more research into the non-thermal effects of EMFs. There are groups out there doing amazing work, but they need our support.
What else can we do?
The ICBE-EMF paper also emphasizes the importance of educating the public.
Right.
The more people understand about the potential risks of EMFs, the more they'll demand accountability from the companies producing these technologies and the governments that are supposed to be protecting us.
It's about creating a movement, a groundswell of awareness that can't be ignored.
Exactly. And it's also about making informed choices in our own lives.
Right.
Remember all those practical tips we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
Using speakerphone, keeping our phones out of our pockets, limiting screen time, opting for wired connections whenever possible.
Yeah, those small changes can add up both for our individual health and for sending a message to the marketplace that we care about this issue.
Right. It's about taking back our power as consumers and as citizens. It's about saying, we demand safer products, we demand more transparency, we demand a future where technology serves humanity, not the other way around.
I love that it's not about rejecting technology altogether. It's about using it wisely.
Right.
And demanding that it be developed and deployed with our health and well-being in mind.
Absolutely. And it's about recognizing that we have a voice and that our collective voice can make a difference.
So to wrap things up, listener, I know this has been a lot to digest.
Yes.
EMFs are a complex and often controversial issue.
Yeah.
It can feel overwhelming, even a bit scary at times. But here's the takeaway. You're not alone.
Right.
There are scientists, researchers, and everyday people all over the world who are raising these concerns and working towards solutions.
Absolutely.
And remember, knowledge is power.
It is.
The more we know, the better equipped we are to make choices that protect our health, our families, and our planet.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that's all the time we have for today, but thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
It has, and I hope it's been informative and empowering for you as well.
You too.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.
Absolutely.
This conversation is just beginning.